The Prime Minister's first overseas visit in his third term, and Prime Minister during his visit for the G7 summit will be touching upon a number of agendas. He was also welcomed by the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, who greeted him with a namaste. Prime Minister Modi was spotted sitting next to UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak for quite some time as well, and both of them were seen having a good laugh. Prior to this, he also held a slew of bilaterals, which began with an old friend in the form of France, as the Prime Minister met Emmanuel Macron as well. The two leaders discussed Horizon 2047 plan, AI, of course, defense and strategic partnerships across various platforms. And shortly after his meeting with Macron, the Prime Minister held a meeting with Rishi Sunak, where the two leaders expressed satisfaction on the progress made in free trade agreements between the two countries. Additionally, the first surprise bilateral was a key one held with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, where the two leaders discussed the situation which is ongoing in Ukraine. And apart from that, the Prime Minister met different leaders on the sidelines of the G7 summit. Now that the Prime Minister has entered his third term in office, the big question is, what is India's role in geopolitics of the world today, having established itself as a global leader in a number of areas? We'll get some perspective on this with our guest. Joining us on the show is Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee, former diplomat. Also joining us on the show is Professor Madhav Nalapat, editorial director of the Sunday Guardian. Mr. Surinder Singh Lali, international affairs expert and a political analyst, also joins us on the show. Major General G.G. Dwivedi, global strategic and defense expert, also with us on the program. Last but by no means the least, Mr. Gautam Mukherjee, senior journalist, who also joins us on the show. Ambassador Mukherjee, I'll begin with you, ma'am. Ma'am, it's simple to see the reaction that people have when they see the Prime Minister. Obviously, this government in its last 10 years and hopefully in the next 5 years is going to continue the path that it has taken in terms of bonhomie, in terms of basically exercising a diplomacy, a soft diplomacy, which not only nullifies any conflicts but also gives way to a lot of advocacy in terms of associations at a number of levels, including defense. How would you categorize the G7 vis-a-vis what we saw in G20? Of course, the technical difference is known to all. The fact of the matter is that most of the hugs and most of the conversations that you are seeing here stem from a personal equation and chemistry and bonhomie that the Prime Minister has been able to cultivate. And that has resonated into a national dialogue, which of course everybody is able to see and to some extent be proud of as well. Ambassador Mukherjee.
Absolutely, Vineet. First of all, I'd like to say that the G20 plus one is actually a more dynamic grouping because it consists of the real power of the new world, whereas G7 is actually like a declining group. They have many problems, political, economic, etc. But the whole issue is that G7 is the old world, including our past colonizers. That G7 finds that India and India's Prime Minister plays a vital role in the politics and economics of the new world order. And therefore, as you rightly pointed out, the hugs, the bonhomie, the conversations, some of them extremely important, even from a symbolic point of view, like the big hug to the Pope, the conversation with Zelensky, which underlined the importance on the part of PM of dialogue and diplomacy coming on the eve of this peace summit in Geneva, where Russia has not been invited, by the way, which is unfortunate. And the discussions with, I would put the French President Macron ahead of Rishi Sunak. Rishi Sunak is a lame duck. He's going to lose the elections. But Emmanuel Macron is a major player. The elections are still some time off. He's taken a gamble. He's called for a parliamentary election. But whatever it is, he's president of France, one of the most important strategic partners. He, along with Biden, who again is facing an election, are the two pillars of support for India in its Western outreach. Meloni is a new power center because as power shifts inexorably within the European Union from the center and left of center to right of center, Meloni's party is becoming more and more important. When the Lisbon Treaty was negotiated, parties like Meloni were kept completely marginalized. Today, you see new power equations. And where do they stem from? They stem from Europe's economic crisis brought on by unilateral sanctions imposed on Russia because the EU failed to realize that in today's globalized world, sanctions imposed to punish Russia come right back to punish you. So they are in economic crisis. We've managed Ukraine, touchwood, Russia conflicts and oil much more efficiently than they have. We have utilized existing laws to ensure that the Indian economic growth doesn't suffer. And I think there's a lot that this G7 lot need to learn from India. And clearly, it was a most successful visit for PM so soon after an exhausting electoral campaign, the swearing in, etc. I would say actually that it indicates that, like in his earlier two terms, he is going to be very leading from the front as far as foreign and security policy is concerned, because that's his area of interest apart from domestic, and that's very good for India's image internationally, because the world expects a lot from this new rejuvenated India in Modi 3.0. Vineet.
At India's participation in the G7, we've been invited to this summit a number of times for the past few years, and the fact of the matter is that everybody understands that the heft that India is beginning to portray is definitely indicative of one fact, Jalal Dwivedi, and one fact alone, that going forward, perhaps more than China, is India that you're going to need. India is perhaps going to become the fourth largest economy. We are going to overtake Japan in the next few years, and that also makes us having an economy which is bigger than some of the countries in G7 alone, perhaps not Germany and the United States. So obviously, the G7 recognizes this.
Well, Vineet, absolutely. No gainsaying that G7 definitely is a global forum. We cannot underwrite it for simple reason that it has three P5 countries, and also it has definitely leading economies. When we compare economies, we only don't go by GDP, but also we go by per capita. So therefore, when you look at the per capita, these countries are far ahead of where we are. We are still developing. Point number one. Now, this forum is primarily economic and security forum, and it is taking place in very trying times when there are a number of global problems. Primarily, the focus is on Ukraine and, of course, on the West Asia. And the fact is that Indian Prime Minister is invited to the forum itself speaks volume of India's image, India's stature, and how the world looks at India. Now, here there are 3-4 points which are very important. First and foremost, when India is rising, India has a lot of goodwill compared to China, where I think globe has concerns, and Chinese are the destabilizing factor. On the contrary, India is a stabilizing factor. It has a lot of goodwill, and India's projection by the Prime Minister and by our leaders has been that we believe in shared progress, we believe in the humanity, and we are also the voice of South, because we believe that the world has to progress together. And Prime Minister Modi had made 2-3 important points in this forum. First and foremost, he has talked of humanity-oriented approach. Secondly, he has said that the technology divide between the West and the developing nations needs to be bridged. And he has also talked about sharing of technology like AI and also the reliable supply chains. So all I can say is that India being at this forum, it's I think, great credit, and also speaks volume of our image. Prime Minister Modi has done a great job, especially when it comes to projecting India, when it comes to projecting our viewpoint that dialogue and diplomacy is the way forward, and we are one which we not only preach peace, but we practice peace. And I think to that extent, India's place under Mr. Modi and India's projection in the G7 is a great advantage, not only to India, but also to the developing world and South as such. Vineet.
Absolutely right. And Professor Nalapat also joins us at this point in time. Professor Nalapat, we just had a discussion on what's happening in South China Sea as well. All these G7 countries, Professor Nalapat, obviously they're trying to contain, China economically and geopolitically as well. And obviously, these countries are also looking to, in fact, stand with India, considering the fact that nobody wants to deal with a country that has expansionist policies, is toxic in nature, and the next alternative, the next best alternative for them is obviously India here.
Well, I'd like to say, Vineet, that Prime Minister Modi is absolutely right when he pointed out to the G7 meeting and the extended meeting that that democracy in India has been shown by the world's largest election ever in history. More than 900 million people eligible to vote, and a record number of individuals in any democracy by far, double, triple the next two or three put together, have actually voted. So from that point of view, Prime Minister Modi is coming after a very successful election has been conducted, in which there has been a fair result, and that indicates the strength of democracy. So I think that would have given him a very significant moral stature when he went to the G7 meeting, because after all, the G7 talks a lot about democracy. What they have not really been paying very much attention to, frankly, not sufficient attention to, is the expansionism of China that has been so clearly brought out by General Dwivedi. The fact is that the Chinese expansionism has gone almost unchecked by NATO. NATO is obsessed with Russia. NATO is obsessed with Ukraine. And I mean, it's not true that it's because Ukraine is a European country and some of the other trouble spots are not. That can't be the reason. But the reality is so much of NATO's attention, including in this particular meeting, was G7's attention was basically directed towards Ukraine. And in the process, what was not sufficiently mentioned was the fact that the PRC is now posing a real threat to freedom of navigation, freedom of shipping, is a real threat to the land borders of several countries. It is also threatening to invade an independent democracy, Taiwan. All this, frankly, the G7 ought to have paid a lot of attention to that, for the simple reason that China is today very much more powerful in economic terms than Russia, in military terms than Russia, and where the Indo-Pacific is concerned, Chinese expansion is there for everybody to see. And the Indo-Pacific is the crucial theater of the future. So I would say that together with the concerns of the global South, which the Prime Minister has raised in the G20 meeting last year and today at the G7, the fact is that the Indo-Pacific needs to be looked at much more attentively, much more than has been the case so far by the G7. And in this process, the G7, of course, realized that India is the indispensable power. And I would say that is, apart from the strength of Indian democracy, that partly explains the very warm welcome given to Prime Minister Narendra Modi.
Absolutely right. Gautam, in fact, there are also chances that the Prime Minister might, have a chat with Justin Trudeau in the, this particular summit. And the fact of the matter is that the separatist issue, which both the countries have been trying to address, has, led to a number of misunderstandings as well. Do you think this is perhaps the right time for the Prime Minister to bring that up?
To talk of separatist issues are almost old hat. It has been going round and round with very little chance of an immediate solution. But the war in Ukraine, I think, is on its way to finding a compromise. And in that, India's relationship with Russia should have an impact in terms of the negotiations, because we may be able to work with Russia to accept a ceasefire as long as Russia gets to keep the territory it already has. India may be the country that can persuade NATO, the EU, and Ukraine to accept the ground reality. And if that happens, it brings matters to a conclusion. Like the UNSC, which is hamstrung because of the veto powers of all of them, all five, but used very extensively by China, quite often supported by Russia, to nullify most initiatives taken by the other three. Similarly, in the G7, there is an enormous dependence, as the other panelists pointed out, but more in terms of the threat. But I'm talking in terms of the dependency, the economic dependency that most of Europe, Western Europe, and America has on China, which hamstrings them from taking any really tough measures against China when it is belligerent with its neighbors, as well as in terms of the free passages in the international waters. Now, how they're going to get out of this, there is again India, which is the solution, because the more they rely on India economically, the less the dependency on China. But it is not going to be sudden or very quick, but it needs to be done, not just initially. Usually when you go there to the West, you are talking of what you need. But India is in a position to provide an escape hatch for Europe and America. It is what they need. And in terms of being representative of the G20 and now G20 plus one, the movement of technology, which Mr. Modi pointed out, is a very important issue, because most of the technology is tied up in exclusivities and patents, and is not available to even countries like India, which they need, let alone the global South. So this is something that in several areas where, in order for the Western countries and America to make progress, they actually have to share technology rather than keep it to themselves or charge exorbitant amounts to offer it to anyone else. This is also something, you see, in many ways, these people, the G7, have painted themselves into a corner, and India becomes a very important country for them to get out of their difficulties without losing face. Vineet.
Absolutely. And Mr. Lali, Gautam did bring out a very important point that India has also been a crusader for the global South, which largely seems to be unrepresented when it comes to a number of these forums, including countries like Canada and Germany. They have in fact been accused of not siding with the global South when making policies, especially which have to do at an international level.
Thank you, Vineet. It's a pleasure and honor to be here, and a big namaste. Well, Vineet, the only problem of having such a distinguished panel and me being the last speaker is that there isn't much left to speak. But however, I'm still going to stick my neck out and say, Vineet, the West needs us. If you look at the top G7 countries also, I mean, out of the G7, the G5, the GDP growth is less than 1%. So, I mean, 2 points, I'm just going to take this from the head, is counter China and being a link between the global, North and the South is where they broadly need us. And, out of the last 11 G7s, 5 have been attended by Mr. Modi. And I think we've done a great job, right, from water conservation to solar energy to single-use plastic, the COVID diplomacy. And, when the Ukraine war goes on, we sort of were the voice for the global South for affordable energy prices. So, Vineet, I feel be it G7, G20, BRICS Quad or SCO, they need India, because India is probably the most balancing factor. Even if you talk about soft power migration or technology, they need us because, their economies are all sunset economies now. The shift is actually shifting from, the American hegemony, and all of these are up for revision. So I think this is India's moment, and Vineet, again, at the risk of not sounding arrogant, they need us. Thank you, Vineet.
All right, we've also run out of time. We're going to take concluding thoughts from all our guests. Ambassador Mukherjee, ma'am, we'll begin with you. Of course, the big elephant in the room, whenever it comes to these international forums, is, for one reason or the other, and we've discussed South China Sea just a little while ago, is China, of course.
But absolutely, and the G7 need to reflect that because of their complete unilateral focus on Russia, they have weakened Russia and strengthened China. And is it good for the security of the West or for international peace and security is a question they need to reflect upon internally. China is not the elephant in the room because India is the elephant in the room. China is the dragon in the room beneath, as I always say. And the dragon can only be controlled by the elephant, not by the West. So they need us, they need India, the elephant, to control the dragon. But yes, they need to also reflect that they have managed to strengthen the dragon at the expense of the big Russian bear. And is that going to be helpful for international peace and security and for the West? I very much doubt it. Are they going to accept it soon? I'm very pessimistic. So I'm sorry to end your programs on a pessimistic note, Vineet, but I think that these 7 guys, we saw them, 6 and 1 lady, they need to get their act together as far as understanding the threat, the existential threat that China presently poses to the existing Western world order created after World War II.
Jal Dwivedi?
Well, Vineet, I think today is what we call it providence or design. India is very well placed, whether you take it geostrategically, you take it economically. And world is very comfortable with India's rise. And that's what we need to exploit, and that exactly is being done by our leadership. Now, 2 important points. First and foremost, every nation have their own national interests, so also India. While we are a stabilizing factor, we are a balancing factor, but we need to take care that our interests are not compromised when there is a kind of a competition or confrontation between the West and the dragon. And second point is that we need to continue our policies of shared progress, of stability, and as a vibrant democratic system. And I think we will chip in, whether it comes to realigning the supply chains or de-risking. I think as other panelists have said, well, India needs West and West needs India. It is always reciprocity when we talk of diplomacy. Vineet.
Professor Nalapat?
Vineet, I want to say that technology is dual use. And the reality is that the high-end technology is particularly subject to lethal uses. That being the case, and given the abundant talent that we have in India, plus the fact that India is a democracy, a peaceful democracy, I think it would be important for tech companies to shift to India rather than continue in China, where their own products may be in danger of being used against their own countries on sea, land, or air. And at the same time, Prime Minister Modi has very correctly emphasized the role of the Global South and the importance of the Global South. And I think that is a wake-up call for the G7 that has to do a lot more for the Global South, for the simple reason that this complete obsession with themselves and frankly, this continuing obsession with Europe rather than Asia, I think that is harming their overall interest. And in a way, frankly, the invitation to Prime Minister Modi, definitely, and Prime Minister Modi's very measured language at the G7 meetings ensured that the voice of India was understood, and this voice is completely contrarian to the actions of China.
Gautam?
No, I think, going to this G7 in the outreach section just for a day will contribute to the continuity of India's development of its own military infrastructure with the help of France and the United States in the main. What will emerge out of this great warmth with Italy under Meloni remains to be seen. And though Britain is well entwined under Sunak, what will happen after the elections remains to be seen. But net-net, continuity is the key. That is what is working in India after this long and arduous election. And that continuity with the G7 means working with France and the United States to keep a pace of the kind of work we're doing in defense manufacturing.
All right.
Vineet.
Mr. Lali, concluding thoughts from you, sir, and then we wrap up.
Vineet, although the jury's out on this one, and especially in the Russian context, I don't want to sound pessimistic, but the way the Western powers have frozen the central bank assets of Russia, and the way they are kind of just throwing in money for Ukraine and how they want that debt to be serviced, I think there is more turbulence coming our way too. Thank you.
All right. On that note, we're going to dip into a short break. Would like to thank all our guests who joined us and gave their expert perspective on this matter.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.